The studio lights were blinding, hot and unforgiving. I remember the weight of the microphone pack on my belt, the slick, cool surface of the host's desk, and the smug grin I wore like a badge of honor. That grin is seared into the memory of millions now. My name is Dr. Julian Croft, and I was the man who, on a primetime cable news show, held up a small pocket-sized Bible, looked directly into the camera, and with a flourish of theatrical contempt, tore a page from the Gospels. The sound of that crisp paper ripping was amplified across the nation. "This is what I think of your ancient fairy tales," I bellowed, my voice full of the self-assured arrogance that only a man who believes he has all the answers can possess. The host just smirked, his eyes gleaming. It was ratings gold, and I was his star gladiator, slaying the dragon of superstition for a captivated audience. At 58 years old, I had built an empire on a foundation of pure, unassailable logic. As a tenured philosophy professor at a respected university, my life's work was the systematic dismantling of faith, what I so eloquently called a crutch for the weak-willed. My world was a fortress of empirical fact, of observable data and peer-reviewed evidence. There was no room for ghosts, no space for spirits, and certainly no tolerance for a God I could not measure, test, or quantify. That night on television felt like a coronation. I had taken the battle to the heart of the enemy, into the living rooms of the faithful, and I had, in my mind, won the definitive victory. I walked off that set feeling 10 feet tall, a champion of reason in an age of comforting lies. My home, however, was a different kind of battlefield, a place of quiet, undeclared war. My wife, Helen, a woman of intellect and grace, endured my militant atheism with a silent, persistent faith that I found both infuriating and, in a secret corner of my mind, I refused to acknowledge, strangely resilient. I'd catch her in quiet moments, her fingers tracing the outline of a small worn wooden cross she wore on a chain around her neck, her lips moving in a silent prayer she knew I would only mock. We lived in a state of carefully negotiated truce. I wouldn't ridicule her hobby in her presence, and she wouldn't try to save me from my own intellect. But the tension was always there, a low hum of dissonance beneath the surface of our life together. My sister, Sarah, was far less subtle. She runs her church's prayer chain. A devout evangelical whose faith is as loud and vibrant as mine was cold and dismissive. She called me the moment I got home from the studio, her voice choked with sobs. "Julian, how could you?" she wept. "You have to repent. You don't know what you're doing." I just laughed. It was a short, sharp, cruel sound. "Oh, Sarah," I said, condescendingly, "save the drama. It was just paper." But it was never just paper, was it? It was a symbol, and the venom with which I attacked it came from a deep, bitter well inside of me. I saw faith as the enemy of progress, the great stunter of human potential. I'd argue in my lectures that religion was responsible for more suffering, more wars, and more ignorance than any other force in human history. I would look out at my students, young, impressionable minds, and see it as my solemn duty to liberate them from the shackles of their inherited superstitions. I took pride in being the intellectual boogeyman, the one who wasn't afraid to say the emperor had no clothes. My pride was my armor, my intellect my sword. I was utterly convinced of my own rightness, so secure in the world I had constructed that I couldn't see the fragile glass walls I had built around my own heart. I believed I was a man of strength because I needed nothing and no one beyond the observable world. The truth is, I was the weakest man I knew, terrified of the silence, terrified of the unknown, and most of all, terrified of the possibility that I might, in fact, be wrong. That night, basking in the glow of my television triumph, I felt invincible. I had no idea I was standing on the edge of a cliff, and that the world I had so carefully built was about to be utterly and completely demolished. If this story, my story, is already speaking to you in some way, if you've ever felt lost, or perhaps too certain, I ask that you follow along on this journey with me. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and click that notification bell so you don't miss what comes next. Give this video a like if you feel so moved. And I'd love to know where my words are landing tonight. Please leave a comment below and just let me know what city or country you're watching from. It helps me feel connected to you, to know we're all in this vast, mysterious world together. The adrenaline from that television appearance carried me for 3 days. My phone rang incessantly with calls from colleagues, old students, even rival academics, all congratulating me on my courage. My inbox was flooded with emails praising my unflinching commitment to reason. I was the talk of every secularist blog and podcast. I felt like a general returning from a victorious campaign, having routed the forces of ignorance. At home, the air was thick with a silence more damning than any argument. Helen moved around me like a ghost, her face pale, her eyes holding a deep, distant sorrow. She didn't mention the show, not once. She didn't have to. Her quiet grief was a constant, low-frequency hum of accusation that I chose to ignore. I was too busy polishing my laurels. I was Dr. Julian Croft, the intellectual giant. I was untouchable. And then came Saturday afternoon. I remember the light. It was that soft, golden light of late autumn, streaming through the living room window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Helen was in the kitchen, and the smell of baking bread, a comforting domestic scent, filled the house. Sophie, our beautiful, brilliant Sophie, was on the floor, surrounded by her Legos. At 8 years old, she had a mind like a steel trap and a laugh that could shatter glass. She was building a spaceship, a complex, asymmetrical thing, chattering away to herself about its warp drive and plasma cannons. I was sitting in my armchair reading a dense philosophical text, occasionally smiling at her monologue. It was a moment of perfect, ordinary peace, the kind of moment you don't even notice until it's gone forever. She suddenly went quiet. I looked up from my book, annoyed at the interruption to my thoughts. "Sophie?" I asked. She didn't answer. She was just staring. Her eyes, usually so bright with life and mischief, were vacant, fixed on a point somewhere beyond the wall. A small tremor ran through her body. "Sophie, honey, what is it?" I said, my voice sharper now, and then she simply fell. It wasn't dramatic. It was a slow, boneless crumpling to the side, her little body going limp amidst the colorful plastic bricks of her unfinished starship. The next few hours are a blur of disjointed, nightmarish images. Helen's scream. The wail of the ambulance siren growing louder, then deafening. The frantic, sterile chaos of the emergency room. And the waiting. Oh God, the waiting. It's a special kind of torture, sitting in a plastic chair under the buzzing fluorescent lights of a hospital waiting room, while the universe you once commanded shrinks to the size of a single closed door. I tried to apply my intellect to the situation. I catalogued the possibilities, ran through differential diagnoses I half remembered from medical journals I'd read. I was trying to solve it, to reason my way out of the terror that was clawing at my throat, but my logic was a useless tool, a child's toy in the face of this monstrous, unknowable thing. All my theories, all my certainties, all my carefully constructed arguments against the ephemeral, they all dissolved into a single primal prayer I didn't even know I was capable of. Please, no. Not her. Please. The doctor who finally came to speak to us was a young man with tired eyes. He used words like glioma, brainstem, and inoperable. The words were precise, scientific, the language of my world, but they were just sounds. The only thing I truly heard was the final verdict, delivered with a clinical, detached pity that was somehow worse than any overt emotion. 6 months, he said, maybe less. I'm very sorry. 6 months, 180 days. That was the sum total of my daughter's future, delivered to me as a cold, hard, empirical fact. My God, science had spoken, and it had passed a death sentence. The fortress I had built around my life, the one I had just defended so proudly on national television, didn't just crack. It was obliterated. In an instant, I was no longer a celebrated professor or a champion of reason. I was just a man, a father, standing in the rubble of his life, choking on the dust of his own arrogance. The world I knew had ended, and in its place was a children's oncology ward, a quiet, carpeted hell of beeping machines, the antiseptic smell of fear, and the hushed, weeping ghosts of parents who had been given the same sentence. My pride was gone. My intellect was a joke. I had nothing. I was at the bottom of a pit so deep and so dark, I couldn't even see the memory of light. If you're still with me, if you've ever found yourself in a place that dark, then you know this journey isn't an easy one. I'm sharing this because I have to, and if it helps even one person feel less alone, it's worth it. Please, if you would, give this video a like and make sure you've hit that notification bell, because what happened next in that hospital room is something I still struggle to explain, even to myself. The weeks that followed were a slow, grinding descent into a very personal hell. Time in a children's oncology ward doesn't move in a linear fashion. It's measured in blood draws, chemotherapy cycles, and the fluctuating numbers on a monitor. Sophie, my vibrant, chattering girl, began to disappear. Her laughter, once the soundtrack of our home, became a rare and fragile whisper. Her hair, that beautiful cascade of auburn curls, fell out in soft clumps on her pillow. She became a small, frail creature lost in a sea of white hospital sheets, tethered to the world by a web of IV tubes and wires. And I, Dr. Julian Croft, the master of logic and reason, could do nothing but watch. My intellect, my once mighty sword, was just a shard of rust. I would sit by her bedside for hours, sometimes reading to her, other times just staring at the rhythmic, metronomic beep of the heart monitor, the only constant in a world that had lost all its bearings. My arguments, my books, my television appearances, they were all a bitter joke. What good was a syllogism against a glioma? What comfort could empirical data offer to a father watching his child fade away? I was a hollowed-out cavern where a man used to be, filled only with the echoing sounds of my own powerlessness. I stopped sleeping. The nights were the worst. The hospital corridors would grow quiet, the daytime bustle replaced by a hushed, sacred stillness, broken only by the soft weeping from another room or the squeak of a nurse's shoes. It was in one of those endless, suffocating nights, about 3 weeks into our stay, that it happened. I was sitting in the uncomfortable visitor's chair, my head in my hands, having reached a point of exhaustion so profound, it felt like a state of non-being. I wasn't thinking. I wasn't reasoning. I was just empty. A vessel of pure, undiluted grief. And then, the quality of the room began to change. It wasn't a sound or a sudden event. It was a shift in the very atmosphere. A soft golden light began to fill the space. It didn't come from the window which overlooked the dark city, nor from the fluorescent fixture above. It seemed to emanate from the air itself, as if the very atoms in the room were beginning to glow. It wasn't a harsh, blinding light. It was warm, liquid, and incredibly gentle. It carried with it a silence that was more profound than the absence of sound. It was a living silence, and it was filled with an undeniable presence. My first thought, the last gasp of my old self, was that I was hallucinating from sleep deprivation. But this felt more real than the chair I was sitting on. And as this light, this presence, filled the room, it seemed to look right through me, not with eyes, but with an all-encompassing awareness. And in that light I saw myself. I saw the smug grin on the television set. I heard the sound of the paper tearing, a sound that now felt like a desecration. I felt the full weight of my pride, my arrogance, my cruel dismissal of billions of souls who had found comfort in the very thing I had so gleefully defiled. A wave of shame so powerful it buckled my knees, washed over me. I slid from the chair onto the cold linoleum floor, expecting, I don't know what, annihilation, judgment, a bolt of cosmic lightning. I deserved it. I had spent a lifetime mocking the very idea of this moment, and now here it was. But the feeling that came from the presence wasn't anger, it wasn't condemnation, It was a wave of something so foreign to my experience, I could barely identify it. It was mercy. It was an ocean of unconditional, unearned love that poured into the hollowed-out cavern of my soul. It didn't excuse my arrogance. It simply loved the broken man cowering on the floor. I began to sob. Not the quiet, choked sobs of a grieving father, but the racking, gut-wrenching wails of a man whose entire existence had just been proven a lie. I was a spiritual arsonist, standing before the very fire I had spent a lifetime trying to extinguish, and instead of being consumed, I was being held. Just as gradually as it had arrived, the presence receded. The golden light faded, and the room returned to the sterile, dim glow of the city lights outside. The beeping of the monitor was just a beep again, but everything was different. I was still on the floor, my face wet with tears, my body trembling. I was shattered, but for the first time in my life, I felt whole. A few minutes later, the door creaked open. It was Helen. She was holding a crumpled brochure, her face etched with a desperate, fragile hope. "Julian," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I've been on the phone with Sarah. There's a healing crusade in Tennessee. People go there and miracles happen." The old Julian would have laughed. He would have torn that brochure into 1,000 pieces with a lecture on mass hysteria and the placebo effect. But the old Julian was dead on that floor. I just looked at her, my eyes still blurry with tears, and saw not a fool but a woman of terrifying strength. She took a deep breath. "We're taking her, Julian. If your science has given up, maybe her mother's faith hasn't." I looked from her determined face to the brochure in her hand. On the cover was a simple graphic of a sunburst, rays of golden light exploding from a center point. It was a pale imitation, a cheap symbol, but it was enough. I didn't have an argument. I didn't have a theory. All I had was the memory of that golden light and the feeling of being held. I pushed myself up, my legs weak, and I nodded. "Okay," I said. "Okay, we'll go." That decision, to drive to Tennessee, was the first step I ever took that wasn't based on a fact, but on a flicker of something I couldn't name. It was a step into the complete unknown. If you've ever had to take a step like that, a step you couldn't possibly explain to your old self, then please stay with me on this journey. Give this video a like to let me know you're here, and be sure to hit that notification bell, because the trip to that crusade and what we found there was a miracle all its own. The drive to Tennessee was the longest, quietest journey of my life. For 12 hours, the world outside the car windows became a monotonous blur of green trees and grey asphalt. Helen slept in the passenger seat, a fitful, exhausted sleep, her hand never leaving the worn wooden cross at her neck. In the back, Sophie was propped up with pillows, pale and quiet, a tiny, fragile princess being transported across a foreign land. And I drove. I drove with my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. And I fought the most brutal war of my life, a war waged entirely within the silent confines of my own skull. The ghost of Dr. Julian Croft, the man I had been just a few weeks prior, was not dead. He was screaming. He was my co-pilot, a relentless, sneering voice of reason in my ear. A golden light, a feeling of mercy, he would scoff. "Julian, for God's sake, listen to yourself. You're a man of science. You know exactly what that was. A textbook case of stress-induced psychosis. A waking dream brought on by extreme sleep deprivation and emotional trauma. Your brain, in an effort to protect itself from the unbearable reality of your daughter's condition, simply created a comforting fiction, a hallucination. It's not real." I would argue back with him, silently, desperately. I listed the facts. The light had a quality, a warmth, a substance that my mind could never have invented. The feeling of being known, of being seen in my entirety and not judged. It was more real than the grief that had been my only companion for weeks. "Coincidence," the voice would counter. "Your wife walks in with a brochure with a sunburst on it right after your brain projects a bright light. It's called priming, suggestibility. You've read the studies, you've taught them. But the logic felt thin, brittle. It was a sheet of ice over a deep, warm ocean of truth that I had felt in that room. The memory of it wouldn't fade. Every time I closed my eyes at a red light, I didn't see the darkness of my eyelids. I saw that gentle, liquid gold. And with that memory came the shame. It rose in my throat like bile. I saw myself on that television stage, preening, arrogant, tearing that page. I heard my own voice dripping with contempt, mocking the very idea of faith. I remembered the hundreds of times I'd seen Helen clutching her cross and rolled my eyes, dismissing her quiet strength as a quaint, harmless delusion. I remembered my sister's weeping voice on the phone. "You don't know what you're doing," she had cried. And she was right. I was a child playing with dynamite, a blind man describing the sun. I had spent my life dissecting the symbols of other people's hope, and now, with my own hope reduced to ash, I found myself crawling through the wreckage, desperately searching for a single, unbroken piece. It was a war fought in the silence of a moving car, the rational mind versus the broken heart. If that battle feels familiar to you, if you've ever felt that kind of war inside yourself between what your head tells you and what your soul knows to be true, please let me know I'm not alone in this. A simple like on this video is more than just a number. It's a sign of connection. And please make sure that notification bell is on, because you won't want to miss where this road finally leads. Sometime in the late afternoon, we passed a small white-steepled chapel on the side of a country road in rural Kentucky. It was the kind of place I would have once photographed ironically, a relic of a bygone era. Helen stirred, her eyes blinking open. She saw the chapel and her expression softened. "Julian," she said, her voice raspy from sleep. Could we just stop for a minute?" The voice in my head screamed, "No, it's a waste of time." It's an empty building full of empty promises, but I looked in the rearview mirror at Sophie, her eyes half open, her small face so weary. I pulled the car over. Helen helped Sophie out, and together they walked slowly up the stone path to the heavy wooden doors. I stayed by the car, leaning against the warm metal, my arms crossed, a sentinel guarding the last fortress of his skepticism. But watching them disappear inside, it felt like I was the one being left behind, exiled from a world of comfort I couldn't understand. After a few minutes, something compelled me to move. My legs felt like lead, but I walked up that path. I put my hand on the cool iron handle of the door and I hesitated. It felt like stepping over the border into an enemy country, a territory I had spent my entire career bombing from a safe, intellectual distance. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was cool and smelled of old wood, lemon polish and the faint, sweet scent of candle wax. Light filtered through simple stained glass windows, painting shifting patterns of color on the worn wooden pews. It was silent, empty, except for Helen and Sophie, who were sitting in the front pew, Helen's arm around our daughter, her head bowed. I stood in the back, an intruder, a spy. My eyes were drawn to the front, to the simple, unadorned wooden cross hanging on the wall behind the altar. It was just two pieces of wood, a geometric shape, nothing more. But as I looked at it, I saw Helen's necklace. I saw the faith that had sustained her through my years of condescension. I saw the hope that had led her to a brochure about a healing crusade in Tennessee. I saw everything I was not. I didn't know what I was doing. I just started walking down the center aisle. Each footstep echoed in the silence. It was the longest walk of my life. I wasn't walking toward a symbol. I was walking toward my own surrender. I stopped a few feet from the altar, staring up at the cross, and for the first time since I was a small boy, forced to mumble prayers I didn't understand, I tried to pray, but no words came. My mind was a blank slate. My throat was tight. All the grand philosophical language, the complex arguments, they were gone. All that was left was the raw, naked agony of a father about to lose his child. My knees gave out, and I knelt on the hard floor. I bowed my head, and finally, a single silent prayer formed, not in words, but in a wave of pure, desperate feeling that flowed from the very core of my being. Help. It wasn't addressed to anyone in particular. It was a message in a bottle, thrown into a cosmic ocean I had long insisted was empty. Please, help me. There was no golden light this time, no voice from the heavens. There was only the silence of that small country chapel and the quiet, profound release of a man who had finally, utterly run out of answers. We drove home in a state of sacred shock. The 12-hour journey back was the mirror opposite of the one that had brought us there. The silence wasn't one of tension and despair. It was a silence of awe, of reverence. Helen and I would just look at each other, and tears would well up in our eyes, no words needed. In the back, Sophie, for the first time in weeks, was humming, a small, simple tune. It was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. The news of what had happened, of the impossible phone call from the oncologist, traveled faster than we did. By the time we pulled into our driveway, the world was already waiting to pass its judgment. The backlash was swift and, in its own way, as brutal as the diagnosis had been. It came not with anger, but with pitying smiles and condescending explanations. My colleagues at the university were the first. They treated me like a patient. "Julian, you've been under unimaginable stress," one of them, a psychology professor, told me over coffee. The mind is a powerful thing. It can create profound psychosomatic experiences. A stress-induced remission, while rare, isn't unheard of. He was trying to give me a scientific life raft, a way to return to the world of reason. But I wasn't drowning anymore. Neighbors would stop me in the grocery store, their voices hushed. "We heard about Sophie, it's wonderful. You know, those big emotional events. The adrenaline can have a powerful placebo effect." Even some of our own family members tried to gently talk me down from the ledge of my newfound something. They didn't have a word for it, and neither did I. They called it a delusion, a psychological break, a desperate fiction my mind had created to cope with grief. They were trying to convince me that the most profound experience of my life had been nothing more than a trick of my own exhausted brain. The old Julian would have eviscerated them. He would have buried them in an avalanche of counter-arguments, cited studies, demanded evidence. But that man was gone. All I could do was look them in the eye, without anger, without any need to defend myself, and say the only thing I knew to be true. It was the most real thing that has ever happened to me. I wasn't arguing a point. I was stating a fact of my own existence. My experience in that hospital room, the surrender in that chapel, they were more real than the floor beneath my feet. And in the face of that quiet conviction, their arguments simply dissolved. You can't reason a man out of a reality he has lived. And so, slowly, they began to leave me alone, writing me off as a man who had lost his daughter and then his mind. But as the old world receded, a new one began to open up. Sarah, my sister, never once said, "I told you so." She just showed up with a casserole and an invitation. "There's a small church just a few towns over," she said. "The people are kind. Just come, sit in the back. No one will bother you." I went. I walked into that simple building, a place I would have once scorned, and I felt peace. I saw a cross on the wall, and it wasn't an object of historical debate. It was a reminder of the mercy that had found me on a cold linoleum floor. I listened to the simple songs, the ones I had mocked as sentimental drivel, and the words spoke of a love so vast it could hold all my brokenness. I found a community not of intellectual gladiators, but of fellow broken people who had also been found. They didn't want to debate me, they just wanted to know my name. They brought us meals. They prayed for Sophie by name. They welcomed the disgraced professor, the man who had torn up their sacred book on national television, as if he were a long-lost brother. About a year later, after a slow and steady series of scans that showed Sophie's continued, medically inexplicable recovery, the church held a community potluck. It was a loud, joyful, chaotic affair. In the middle of it all, the pastor, a gentle man named David, invited people to share stories of what they were thankful for. And I felt a pull, an undeniable compulsion to stand up. My heart hammered against my ribs as I walked to the small makeshift stage. A hush fell over the room. Everyone knew who I was. I was their resident curiosity, their pet intellectual. I gripped the microphone, my hand trembling, and I looked out at their faces. "My name is Julian Croft," I began, my voice cracking, "and many of you know me as the man who used to think he had all the answers. The man who stood on television and, out of a deep and bitter pride, mocked the very faith that fills this room tonight." I took a deep breath. I am here tonight to say that I was a fool, a proud, arrogant fool. I want to ask for your forgiveness for the intolerance I championed, because the very thing I dedicated my life to destroying is the only thing that saved me. It found me at the bottom of the deepest pit imaginable, and it didn't condemn me. It lifted me up. I looked over at Helen, who was holding a sleeping Sophie in her arms, her face wet with tears. This isn't about changing my mind. It's about having my heart broken open. It's about a mercy that doesn't make sense, a love that I will never deserve, and a miracle that is now humming in her mother's arms. My journey isn't over, I know that now. This isn't an ending, it's a beginning. It wasn't about switching from one belief system to another. It was about the death of pride and the birth of humility. It was about my rebellion being met not with wrath, but with a love that healed my daughter and, more impossibly, rescued my own heart from the prison I had built for it. If my story has touched you, if you have ever felt that kind of brokenness or witnessed a grace you couldn't explain, I ask you to join me on this continued journey. Please give this video a like and hit that notification bell, because there is so much more to understand. And I want to ask something of you. Faith isn't about arguments, it's about experience. In the comments below, I would be so honored if you would share, not a debate but a moment when you felt a presence you couldn't explain, a moment when you knew, deep in your soul, that you were not alone. Your story matters. Let's fill this space not with division, but with the quiet, powerful testimony of our own transformed hearts. Thank you for listening.